The Clockwork Conspiracy, a sleep story in the voice of Dr. Watson. When I returned to Baker Street, after several days away from London, it was near the close of a quiet and windless evening. The city had settled into that subdued condition which comes between the final clatter of commerce and the deeper silence of midnight. A thin autumn mist had gathered in the streets and softened the lamps into pale halos, so that the road from Marylebone seemed less a thoroughfare than a dim and floating corridor between islands of gaslight. I remember that my own mood was one of uncommon calm. Travel, even of the most ordinary medical sort, had left me weary in body, but curiously light in mind, and I looked forward to nothing more adventurous than my chair by the fire, a modest supper, and the sight of Holmes stretched in thoughtful disorder across our sitting room. Mrs. Hudson admitted me with that mixture of affection and resignation which long association with my friend had bred in her. Before she spoke, I had already guessed that Holmes was engaged upon something irregular, for there drifted down from the room above a faint metallic tapping, unlike any domestic sound. It was not loud enough to alarm. Indeed, it possessed a kind of minuteness that made it all the more singular. Yet with it, there came another odor besides the familiar tobacco smoke of Baker Street, a sharper scent of oil, brass, and something faintly scorched, as though a tiny engine had been coaxed into life upon the hearth. I entered softly and found the sitting room aglow with low firelight and shaded lamps. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the rug before the grate, his lean frame bent forward, his profile cut in bronze against the coals. Around him lay an untidy crescent of evening papers, folded notes, and little tools of a watchmaker's sort. Between his fingers he held a small object of brass, no larger than a man's palm. It ticked with delicate persistence. Every few moments a wheel inside it shivered into motion, and a sliver of polished metal turned beneath the lamp with a glint like cold water. "Ah, Watson," said Holmes without looking up, "you have returned at the very minute most serviceable to me. Pray shut the door with some gentleness. This small creature has a temperament almost equal to Lestrade's, and dislikes disturbance." I obeyed, and stood for a moment with my hat still in my hand, observing both my friend and the device. "Upon my word, Holmes," said I leave you for 4 days, and return to find that you have taken to nursing mechanical insects by the fire." He smiled in the faint and inward fashion that appeared when some problem had already taken hold of him. "Would that it were no more than that? Sit down, my dear fellow, warm yourself. There is tea upon the tray. And if you can forgive London for resuming its habits in your absence, I shall show you the entertainment with which the city has diverted itself." I drew my chair near the fire and poured what remained in the pot. The room was comfort itself, the old Persian slipper upon the mantel, Holmes's violin in the corner, my dispatch case where I'd last left it, and all around these signs of familiarity, that profound domestic peace, which even the wildest of our adventures never entirely banished from those rooms. Yet the little ticking object kept the atmosphere from complete repose. It introduced, if I may put it so, one grain of metal into the warmth. The case before Holmes had not arrived crashing at our door. It had entered quietly, wound itself among the habits of the room, and sat there beating out its tiny measure of time. Holmes passed the object to me. It was exquisitely made, within a brass casing, no thicker than a pocket almanac. There revolved a train of gears of uncommon fineness. One small wheel bore a pattern of minute teeth cut so cleanly that the metal seemed woven rather than machined. There was no maker's name upon it, yet no hand but one of unusual training could have fashioned so exact a toy. "It was left upon a rosewood desk in St. John's Wood this afternoon," said Holmes. 3 days earlier, another of similar ingenuity appeared in Kensington. Yesterday morning, one turned up in a private library near Belgrave Square. Nothing identical in shape, everything identical in intention. I looked from the thing to the litter of newspapers. Each had been marked with Holmes's pencil. I knew that look in him well. His stillness, when it came in this form, meant not idleness but velocity. Somewhere behind those languid lids, his mind was already many streets ahead, moving through drawing rooms, counting houses, workshops and alleys, with that swift and noiseless certainty which no map could follow. You mean there have been several thefts? Holmes leaned back upon his hands and watched the fire. I mean, Watson, that London has lately discovered a taste for being robbed in a very discriminating manner. And our thief, if thief he be, possesses the bad manners of an artist. Outside, a cab rolled past with muffled wheels. Inside, the brass thing continued its minute and patient ticking. The contrast struck me then, and remained with me afterwards through all that followed. The vast city, half asleep in the dark beyond our windows, and here in our room, one tiny mechanism keeping a private vigil beside the coals. For all the strangeness of the matter, I felt at ease. That was ever Holmes's greatest gift to those who sat near him. He might open a door into danger, yet he did so with such composure that one crossed the threshold almost as calmly as one might move from one lamp-lit room into another. He stretched an arm toward the papers. Read them when you have finished your tea. Read them slowly. There is no merit in haste at the beginning of such affairs. Their shape comes better when permitted to emerge. I did as he advised and spent some minutes in the quiet occupation of reading the marked reports while Holmes resumed his place before the fire. In one house, a carved traveling case had vanished from a locked cabinet. In another, a packet of private memoranda had been removed from beneath account books and ordinary correspondence. In a third, a small ivory miniature, of little value to any stranger, but evidently of deep significance to its owner, had disappeared from an escritoire. The notices were inconsistent in the particulars which newspapers love and police deplore, yet in each one there was some brief and baffled mention of a mechanical trifle left behind. One writer called it a toy, another, with the airy confidence of ignorance, described it as the sort of novelty sold in continental arcades. A third confessed with admirable honesty that no one present could say what purpose the thing had ever been intended to serve. "What strikes you?" asked Holmes. "That the fellow has a taste for dramatic exits." Holmes's eyelids lowered a little further. "That is what strikes the police. It is what the household servants tell the reporters. It is what the reporters tell the public. It is precisely what the designer of these incidents desires to strike everyone. Now go 1 degree deeper." I turned again to the clippings and let my attention rest, not upon the mechanisms, but upon what had been taken. The items were oddly chosen. None represented the easiest object to carry off. None, so far as one might judge from the published accounts, promised the greatest monetary reward. There was in each case a suggestion, faint yet persistent, that the stolen thing might matter less to the world at large than to one particular person, and matter to that person for reasons never openly stated. A memory, a private notation, a packet, a token. The missing object seemed to cast a shadow larger than itself. "It is selection rather than boldness," said I at last. "He does not steal what shines. He steals what means." Holmes raised one finger in approbation. "Excellent, my dear Watson. Always distrust the criminal who appears to be performing for the gallery. Often, the display is arranged at the front, because the true business is being conducted in a quieter chamber behind. These little contrivances are not signatures, they are curtains. And the thing behind the curtain? That," said Holmes, "is the one polite question London has not yet thought to ask." The fire dropped inward with a soft sigh, and I rose to mend it. Holmes spoke on in that low, level tone of his, which made the most singular deductions seem no more agitating than the recitation of weather. He had charted the dates of the incidents. He had compared the households, the occupations of the victims, the local movements of servants and tradesmen, and even the weather upon the evenings in question. He had found no easy social thread connecting them. Yet there existed another pattern, subtler and more persuasive. Each theft had extracted from the apparent disorder of a well-furnished life one object capable of discomposing its owner far beyond market value. A criminal with an appetite for gold would have done better elsewhere. A prankster would not have chosen his targets with such patience. A collector of rare devices would not have left one treasure in order to remove another. "I begin to suspect," said he, "that our unknown operator has no affection at all for stealing. He steals only because society is more attentive to a theft than to a whisper." Holmes seldom put a theory in so nearly moral a form unless the matter itself touched questions beyond mere property. It gave me pause, though not unease. There was too much warmth in the room, too much settled familiarity in his posture, for alarm to flourish. Instead, I felt that peculiar deepening of curiosity which comes when one is conducted by a trusted mind toward something dimly visible, but not yet named. Then the devices are meant to delay interpretation, to distort it, to amuse, to fatigue, to reward the superficial observer with what he takes for an answer. There is always danger in a clever object, Watson. It gives the indolent eye somewhere to stop. He held out his hand, and I returned the mechanism. He balanced it lightly upon his palm. Its little wheels still moved with the grave self-possession of a thing made by someone who respected time, even while making mischief with it. "In all of London," said Holmes, "I know of few men who could have assembled such delicate works, and fewer still who would choose to employ them in this fashion. Yet, before I name workshops and craftsmen, I should like to see whether the pattern continues. A sequence gains authority by repetition. A single strange act may be whim, two may be imitation. By the third, one has the courtesy of design." As though summoned by that very observation, there came a brisk tread upon the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's knock followed, then the door opened to admit Inspector Lestrade. Hat in hand, and irritation in every line of his compact person. The Scotland Yard man looked not merely inconvenienced, but thwarted, and I confess there was something almost restful in the sight, for Lestrade in that condition usually signified that Holmes's evening was about to become my own. "Mr. Holmes," said he, declining the chair until I cleared a place of papers for him, "I have come because London appears determined to fill every respectable desk in the city with clockwork rubbish. There has been another business of the same breed, and the owner makes such a noise that even my superintendent can no longer pretend it is a curiosity fit for the back pages." Holmes did not appear surprised. He only placed the little brass device beside the tobacco jar and folded his long fingers together. "Then, our pattern has had the kindness to repeat itself," said he. "Now, perhaps, it may begin to speak." Lestrade delivered his account in the clipped and practical manner of a man who would have preferred the world to arrange itself according to memoranda and warrants. The latest disturbance had taken place in a house near Regent's Park, occupied by Sir Julian March, a retired administrator of the India Office, and a gentleman more respected in clubs than beloved in drawing-rooms. During a dinner of moderate size, and while no alarm had been raised by servants or guests, a locked cabinet in his private study had been opened, and one narrow dispatch folder removed from within. In the cabinet there remained securities, coin, and an antique snuff-box set with stones enough to tempt a less philosophical marauder. In place of the folder had been found a little silver mechanism shaped with absurd delicacy, like a hound with lifted paw. It neither barked nor sprang, but ticked with maddening steadiness until one of the footmen, in panic and ignorance, thrust it beneath a cushion. "And what was in the folder?" asked Holmes. "Sir Julian says old memoranda, nothing of consequence." Holmes and I exchanged the briefest of glances. This phrase, which recurred with such regularity in the mouths of the afflicted, had already begun to acquire a contrary meaning. "Nothing of consequence to whom," said Holmes. "Lestrade threw up one hand to anyone, if you ask him. Yet there he sits in a towering fright, sending notes to half of Whitehall, and expecting Scotland Yard to recover his private papers before breakfast. If they are worthless, he guards the worthlessness with singular devotion." Holmes rose at once, crossed to the mantel, and took up his coat. "Then we shall save him the embarrassment of his own description. Watson, your hat, if you please, Lestrade. You have done very well to come." The inspector stared. "Very well? I have brought you a complaint and a mechanical dog." "You have brought me progression," said Holmes. "That is infinitely more useful." We drove northward through streets softened by mist and a recent drizzle that had left the pavement dark and reflective as slate. There are few pleasures, to my mind, more companionable than a London cab at night, when one is not obliged to speak. Lestrade muttered once or twice over the idiocy of household staffs. Holmes watched the lamps slip by. I, for my own part, surrendered to the rhythm of wheels and the low rocking of the carriage, and thought that even a matter of secret papers and contrived burglaries could not wholly lose its harshness when approached through such stillness. Sir Julian's house stood in a row of severe and handsome terraces, whose very symmetry suggested privacy, defended by habit. A butler of rigid bearing conducted us through an entrance hall more notable for its polish than for any welcome, and from there into a study lined with dark bookcases, campaign maps, and narrow cabinets fitted with brass locks. The room had an air of disciplined memory. Everything in it appeared arranged not for comfort, but for retention. One might have believed that its owner had spent a lifetime filing away details of the empire, and had at last begun to resemble the cabinets among which he moved. Sir Julian himself was a spare man, with a complexion like old parchment, and a manner at once stately and exhausted. He greeted Lestrade as one receives a troublesome but necessary courier, then turned a cooler eye upon Holmes. "I am informed, Mr. Holmes, that your talents may prove useful where official channels have been unduly slow. I trust no absurd newspaper embellishments have preceded me." "Only the most ordinary ones," said Holmes. "Pray treat me as if I had heard nothing." This answer seemed to please the baronet more than deference would have done. He led us to the cabinet. The lock bore no sign of force. The inner shelves were orderly. A shallow space near the back stood empty. Upon the writing table nearby lay the silver hound, motionless now, though one could imagine its hidden spring, waiting only the smallest invitation. Holmes gave no attention at first to the toy. He examined instead the shelves, the cabinet hinges, the rug beneath the window, the grate, the arrangement of the decanters, and finally Sir Julian's face, while the latter described the missing folder with conscious vagueness. It concerned, he said, some private reflections from his years abroad, nothing which should interest a common thief, notes that had long outlived practical relevance. "And yet you did not destroy them," said Holmes. "I am not in the habit of burning my own papers, merely because the present grows impatient with the past." "Quite so." There was a dryness in Holmes's tone, which told me that he had learned something from the reply, though whether from the words or the manner of their utterance I could not then judge. He turned at last to the silver dog, and set it gently upon the blotter. Its workmanship, if anything, surpassed that of the brass device at Baker Street. The polished casing concealed a movement of astonishing refinement. One wheel had been filed to the thinness of a thumbnail paring. Another carried a tiny engraved mark partly effaced, as though the maker had thought better of vanity at the final moment. "A little more ambitious," said Holmes. "Our correspondent grows confident." "Correspondent," cried Sir Julian. "You speak as though I were being written to." Holmes did not immediately answer. He wound the mechanism half a turn and set it down again. The hound's foreleg lifted, its head inclined by the width of a coin, and the thing emitted not a bark, but a dry and private tick, tick, tick. So absurd an object might have provoked laughter in another room. Here, among dispatch boxes and shaded lamps, it was merely unsettling. "It is possible, Sir Julian," said Holmes at last, "that the person who entered this house wished less to deprive you of a paper than to remind someone that the paper exists." Sir Julian's mouth tightened. "That sounds very like a theatrical nonsense." "I prefer plain burglary. Most men do," said Holmes. "Burglary is honest in its way. It asks less of the imagination." There followed one of those silences in which truth does not appear, but alters the air by passing nearby. The baronet looked toward the curtained window. Lestrade shifted in impatience. Holmes, having said enough for the moment, moved on to the practical inspection of servants' entrances, timings, and lines of approach. Yet I carried away from the study a stronger impression than any single clue might have made. It seemed to me that each new house we visited was not adding merely another instance to a police file. Rather, we were moving through private chambers arranged around one central absent. Each owner denied importance to what was lost, but each denial rang with the same strained hollowness. London's respectable men were being touched, one by one, upon nerves they preferred not to name. When at last we took our leave, the baronet accompanied us only to the study door. His reluctance to say more had by then become more eloquent than disclosure. Outside, the night felt colder, though not inhospitable. Holmes stood a moment on the steps and drew a long breath of mist-laden air. "Well?" said Lestrade. "Well," Holmes replied, "your mechanical dog is less important than the papers it replaces. Sir Julian's papers are less old than he pretends, and our adversary possesses either an uncommon education or a very uncommon grievance. Beyond that, I reserve my pleasures." He entered the cab with the air of a man returning not from failure but from confirmation. I followed, and as the house receded behind us, I felt, beneath the growing intricacy of the affair, a curious persistence of calm. Holmes had not yet solved the matter, yet by his side uncertainty itself became orderly. It no longer rushed at the mind. It arranged itself in rows, like files in a cabinet, awaiting the hand that would one day draw the right one free. The next day passed in a fashion at once active and curiously hushed. Holmes was out before breakfast, and in again by 11, carrying beneath his arm a portfolio stuffed with trade circulars, railway timetables, and 3 narrow volumes on precision engineering in French and German. He ate almost nothing, smoked in little, absent spirals, and on 2 occasions took the silver hound and the brass device into his chemical corner, where he examined them under a lens with the patient devotion another man might have given to illuminated manuscripts. By afternoon he announced that there was one person in Southwark whose opinion he desired above that of any inspector, collector, or clubman in London. "It is not the devices themselves that matter," said he, as we crossed the river in a hansom. "It is the discipline they imply. One learns much of a hand from the things it permits itself. Our man allows no coarseness. He allows no accidental movement. Even his mockery is measured. Such habits are rarely self-taught. Our destination proved to be a narrow lane, standing back from the busier road, as if embarrassed by commerce. At its end, behind a warped gate and a blind of soot-dark windows, there operated a workshop kept by Mr. Gideon Mowbray, formerly attached, so Holmes informed me, to an instrument maker whose chronometers had once found favor with the Admiralty. The room into which we were shown was one of those little kingdoms of exact labor where the outside world appears not excluded, but reduced to irrelevance. Tall clocks, without cases, stood like stripped skeletons against the wall. Boxes of screws, pinions, springs, and jeweled bearings occupied every shelf. The air held the dry sweetness of wood shavings mingled with oil and metal dust. Somewhere in the back, hidden by benches, a regulator beat out a steady measure with such composure that the whole workshop seemed to breathe in time with it. Mowbray himself was a man of late middle age, with a face deeply lined by concentration rather than hardship. He wore a magnifying loupe upon one eye, and removed it only after Holmes had set both devices upon the felted table before him. I observed at once that he recognized quality before he recognized danger. The first expression upon his face was not fear, but offended admiration, as though he had unexpectedly encountered the work of a rival whom he disliked precisely because he respected him. "Where did you come by these?" said he. Holmes smiled. "You perceive that they are not trade curiosities. I perceive that the fellow who made them has fingers steadier than conscience. This balance wheel here is hand-finished. No factory would spend the time. And this pawl spring on the silver, one look at that tempering. It was done by a man who knows how little force is enough." Holmes leaned one elbow upon the table. "Do you know the hand?" Mowbray did not answer at once. He turned the brass mechanism over in his palm, listening with his head slightly bent, like a physician taking the pulse of a difficult patient. The tick softened, quickened, softened again. At length he replaced it with conspicuous care. "I know the school, perhaps," said he. "Swiss methods refined in England, not common, not recent either. There was a small circle of men before my time, and a smaller one during it, who concerned themselves with exact work for exact purposes. Naval instruments, survey gear, sighting assemblies, miniature escapements for work the public never sees. One does not ask too closely who commissioned such things." "You fear the commission more than the craftsman," said Holmes quietly. Mowbray's mouth thinned. "I fear old business that ought to have remained old. A machine can outlive scandal, Mr. Holmes. Sometimes it is the only part of a scandal. Left in working order." That sentence, spoken almost as if against his own will, altered the whole interview. Holmes heard it as sharply as I did. He let a few moments pass, allowing the steady beat of the regulator to settle us all again. "You need not accuse anyone," said he. "I ask only for a direction." Mowbray reached to a drawer, took from it a slip of paper, and wrote down the name of a supplier in Clerkenwell, who had once imported specialized components from Neuchâtel and Bern. He pushed the paper across the table, but did not release it until Holmes's fingers already touched the edge. "If your inquiry leads where I think it may," said he, "take care that your conclusions are not carried too early into official rooms. There are truths which grow more dangerous the closer they come to a desk with a crest upon it." Holmes bowed as one man of intelligence to another. "Your warning does you honor." As we left, I looked back once through the grimy pane, and saw Mowbray standing motionless beside his bench, the silver hound before him, and his own reflection, faint upon the glass. It seemed to me that the old craftsman was not merely disturbed by what we had shown him. He was tired in advance of the consequences of remembering. There is a peculiar fatigue in such men, those who have learned that precision does not protect innocence, but only sharpens the outlines of guilt. We did not at once pursue the Clerkenwell lead. Instead, Holmes suggested that we take a circuit by the embankment and then back toward Baker Street on foot. As the evening was mild and my own spirits, after the stillness of the workshop, disposed toward movement, the river lay under a blue-gray sky, with long streaks of light still lingering in the west. Barges moved like dark thoughts upon the water. Lamps came on one by one. Holmes spoke little, and when he did it was in fragments rather than argument. The devices are escalating in finish. The victims deny too uniformly. The craftsman fears memory, not law, at last, as we turned westward and the sound of the city grew softer around us. He said, "We must be careful, Watson, not to let the elegance of the puzzle harden the heart against the people within it. There is pain under this mechanism. One can hear it if one listens beneath the ticking." That remark, more humane than his reputation would have suggested, remained with me after we regained the sitting room. Once again, Baker Street restored the affair to proportion. Mrs. Hudson brought in a tray. Holmes stretched upon the sofa with half-closed eyes, while I sat by the lamp and copied a note at his dictation to the supplier in Clerkenwell. For a little while the mystery receded to the edge of the room, no more urgent than the rain that had begun tapping faintly against the panes. It was one of those returns to safety which our life together repeatedly afforded. The world outside might be intricate, compromised, and cold, yet there was always this interval in which the fire burned low. The tea steamed gently, and the dark itself seemed content merely to stand at the windows without asking admittance. The rest did not last, though it soothed us while it held. At 9:15, Mrs. Hudson reappeared with a card and the announcement that a lady desired only 5 minutes of Mr. Pugh. Holmes's time. Her tone suggested that the visitor was neither hysterical nor trivial, which in our experience narrowed the possibilities pleasingly. Holmes sat up at once. "A lady with 5 minutes often brings the beginning of a new hour," said he. "Show her up." Our visitor entered with the composure of one accustomed to offices where men mistake confidence for authority and noise for force. She was perhaps not yet 30, plainly but well dressed, with a dark traveling cloak still damp at the hem, and a face whose animation came less from prettiness than from intelligence. There was in her expression that rare union of courtesy and resolution which I have observed in good surgeons and good journalists, though until that evening I had not considered how much the professions share. "My name is Margaret Hale," said she. "I write occasionally for the evening press, but I am not here in that capacity. I ask pardon for the hour. Had the matter seemed less urgent, I should not have come." Holmes indicated the chair nearest the lamp. "Urgency is often the only recommendation a caller requires. Pray sit down, Miss Hale. This is my friend Dr. Watson." She acknowledged me with a quick nod and removed one glove, as if to better handle the packet of papers she carried. "I have heard," she said, "that a number of unusual thefts have lately attracted your notice. 3 households are known to the public. There may be more not yet public. In each case, some object or paper of private significance is missing, and in each case, a mechanical trifle is left behind. I do not ask how much of that is true. I know enough of newspapers to distrust my own trade." Holmes's eyes brightened with genuine interest. "You have not come to gather facts, then?" "No. I have come because one of the names whispered to me this afternoon was that of Sir Julian March. 10 years ago, when my father was employed in the War Office archives, he mentioned that gentleman to my mother with a bitterness I did not understand at the time. He was never a man to gossip, and I remember the name only because his voice changed as he spoke it. My father died 2 winters later, last month. While settling a trunk of his papers, I found among them a memorandum copied in his hand. It referred to a committee review, some missing technical reports, and pressure from above to close the matter without public inquiry. She set the folded sheet upon the table between us. "What matter?" asked Holmes. "I cannot wholly tell. The language is oblique, but there are references to instrument failure in the field, and to revised specifications submitted after procurement had already been approved. It may signify incompetence, it may signify fraud, I do not know. Yet when I heard Sir Julian's name connected with a secret theft, I thought of that paper at once." Holmes read the memorandum twice, without comment. Then he passed it to me. The document was brief, written in a careful, clerkly hand, and all the more suggestive for its restraint. There was mention of range instruments, supplied under emergency schedule to a colonial expedition, of acceptable deviations discovered too late, of recommendations withheld pending ministerial convenience, and of a dissenting engineer whose formal objections had vanished from the official abstract. "Do you know the name of that engineer?" said Holmes. Miss Hale shook her head. Only the initials, ILV. My father wrote them once in the margin, and then scratched them out again, though not so thoroughly that I could not recover them. Holmes leaned back and steepled his fingers. You have rendered me a service, Miss Hale, for which I thank you. Tell me one thing more. Why bring this to me rather than print it? At this she smiled, though without lightness. Because I know the difference between a hint and a case. A newspaper can throw a spark into dry air. It cannot choose where the fire runs. If this concerns private wrongdoing alone, exposure may be enough. If it touches government, contracts, old campaigns, and men whose reputations have grown into institution, then mere publication may bury the truth beneath denial before it can even draw breath. I thought it wiser to place it first in hands which prefer proof to excitement. Holmes bowed his head slightly. It was praise from him when he responded to sound judgment with silence. There followed a conversation, quieter than many interviews, and more fruitful than most examination. Miss Hale knew little with certainty, but she knew how to distinguish what she knew from what she suspected, and this alone made her valuable. She had heard, through a sub-editor whose brother served as a clerk to a certain military contractor, that papers had recently gone missing from 2 households, not named in print. She had also heard that one gentleman, now publicly indignant, had privately ordered his servants not to describe the missing item too exactly. A person who wishes the police to recover a thing, said she, does not usually begin by concealing what the thing is. Unless, said Holmes, he fears the recovery almost as much as the loss. Her eyes met his. That is very nearly my thought. The rain strengthened outside and moved in soft stripes down the windows. Holmes asked 1 or 2 more precise questions, then rose to return the memorandum. She declined to take it. Keep it for the present, if it matters. It may matter more to you than to me. If it does not matter, then I have lost only a copy. I could not help but admire both her steadiness and the elegance with which she avoided dramatizing her own courage. She had not come to play the heroine of a sensation piece. She had come because a half-buried pattern had stirred an old memory, and because her conscience, once alerted, would not permit her sleep. There are many kinds of bravery. Quiet persistence among papers and rumors is one of the least romantic and most useful. When she departed, Holmes accompanied her to the landing with a degree of formality which in him signified respect. Upon his return, he stood some moments with the memorandum in his hand, then placed it beside the silver hound and the brass mechanism, as though the 3 belonged together. Watson, said he, our little Clockwork chorus has acquired a note of history. You attach weight to the initials? I attach weight to omissions. A missing report is often more eloquent than a published one. Still, the middle of a mystery is not the place for confidence. It is the place for patience. He sank again upon the sofa and closed his eyes, though I knew by the faint movement of one finger upon the armrest that his mind was far from rest. For my own part, I sat by the fire and let the evening settle about me. Miss Hale's visit had deepened the case without making it harsher. We were no longer dealing merely with private anxieties among the prosperous. Behind the velvet curtains and polished desks, there loomed now a dim machinery of offices, committees, and suppressed papers. Yet the room held its calm. The coals glowed. The rain whispered. The clock upon the mantel advanced with a domestic honesty no contrivance could counterfeit. It is in such intervals, I think, that one best endures the approach of grave matters. The mind is allowed to feel their weight, without yet being asked to lift it. Late that night, just as I had resolved to retire, Holmes spoke again without opening his eyes. If there is an engineer behind this affair, said he is not a vulgar blackmailer. Blackmail feeds upon fear and stops when paid. This series moves onward, as if guided by a purpose independent of profit. There is method, and under method, a grievance. Tomorrow, we shall see whether the grievance has left a trail in trade. I asked whether he meant the supplier in Clerkenwell. In part, and in part, I mean my brother now. No one acquainted with my singular friend will need to be told what change such a sentence introduced into the atmosphere. Mycroft Holmes rarely entered Sherlock's investigations, except when a matter brushed against those broad and hidden processes by which governments digest information and conceal their indigestion. That Holmes should think of him now did more than sharpen my curiosity. It lent the case a depth which no newspaper line could have given it. Yet even so, I retired not agitated but reflective. The rain had eased. The lamps beyond the curtains were blurred by moisture and mist. Somewhere below, a carriage passed and was gone. Above all persisted that soft, mechanical beat from the table near the hearth, where the brass device ticked on in the dark, as if patiently marking time until some buried truth should choose at last to move. It was in the early afternoon of the following day that we made our way to the Diogenes Club, where silence is cultivated with such devotion that even the turning of a newspaper may carry the force of an indiscretion. There are many rooms in London that seek to impress by luxury, and many more by solemnity. None, to my knowledge, achieve quite the peculiar authority of that place, where the suppression of unnecessary sound produces not peace alone, but power. To enter it after the ordinary streets is to feel at once that language itself has been put under regulation. Mycroft received us in one of the smaller rooms set aside for conversation, though even there one spoke as if the walls might prefer otherwise. He sat heavily, but not lazily, in a leather chair, his great frame composed, his broad pale face marked by that expression of almost indolent intelligence which in him concealed capacities before which many active men would have appeared mere clockwork. He greeted me with grave civility and Sherlock with the faintest glimmer of irony. "You have the look," said he, "of a man who has been entertained by society's private inconveniences and now suspects that society has understated them." Holmes remained standing. "I seek not wit, Mycroft, but perspective, a sequence of selective thefts, victims outwardly unconnected, mechanical objects of uncommon finish left behind, and a whisper from old files involving procurement irregularities and a vanished dissenting engineer. Does that pattern awaken any memory in you?" If a stranger had observed Mycroft at that instant, he might have seen no change whatever. To me, who had watched the brothers together on several memorable occasions, there was one. The eyes, usually half-veiled in reflective amusement, became for a fraction of a second entirely attentive. It was not surprise. It was recognition reluctantly arriving on time. "My dear Sherlock," said he, "there are patterns in this city which, if chased too briskly, lead not into revelation but into administration. I advise you to cultivate some healthier enthusiasm. Persian manuscripts, for example, or poisoning among provincial bankers. Those subjects rarely inconvenience departments." Holmes drew a chair opposite him, but did not sit. "Then I am near a department. You are near old embarrassment," said Mycroft. "That is worse. Crime may be corrected. Embarrassment is archived." He rose then, and crossed to the window, where the light outlined his shoulders against the pale afternoon. I noticed that he kept his hands clasped behind him while he spoke, a habit of his when caution was engaged against sympathy. "There was, some years ago," he said, "a committee review of technical failures connected with equipment supplied under conditions of urgency. Reports conflicted, careers were exposed, opinions were revised. The matter was closed in a manner judged expedient at the time and unnecessary to reopen now. If some surviving spirit has chosen to regard closure as concealment, that is regrettable. It is not necessarily actionable, nor necessarily false," said Holmes. Mycroft inclined his head, but did not turn. "Truth and utility are not twins, Sherlock. They are distant relations who prefer not to dine together." I had seldom heard so much admitted in so few words. Holmes heard more in them than I did, for his face took on that sharpened stillness, which with him signified not anger, but full concentration. "This surviving spirit," said he, "is an engineer." Mycroft looked back over his shoulder. "I have not said so. You have allowed me to. That is not the same service." At last Holmes sat. The movement itself seemed deliberate, as though he had chosen for the moment to make inquiry less confrontational and more inevitable. "I do not require confessions from you, brother. I require only this. Am I dealing with a mind that seeks profit, revenge, or exposure?" For the first time, Mycroft's expression lost a degree of its official smoothness. "Exposure," said he. "If the same person is involved, then exposure and exposure, in certain old matters, can strike the innocent as broadly as the culpable. One cannot always reopen a sealed chamber without disturbing dust which settles in many lungs." Holmes was silent. Mycroft resumed his seat with a faint weariness. "Let the police recover their papers if they can. Let frightened gentlemen deny their fright. But you, Sherlock, if you value proportion, should not press farther than is needed to prevent disorder. There are cases in which full illumination is merely another form of fire." This was as near to a warning as Mycroft ever came. It was delivered without drama, without threat, and for that reason possessed the greater force. Yet I knew my friend too well to think it would halt him. Warnings of that refined and political character commonly did the reverse. They convinced Holmes not that pursuit was unwise, but that the point of pressure had at last been correctly located. We left soon afterwards. Not another word on the subject passed between the brothers in the club itself. Once outside, however, where the ordinary movement of cabs and pedestrians restored a more democratic atmosphere, I ventured to say that Mycroft had sounded almost uneasy. "He is uneasy," said Holmes. "My brother fears not discovery itself, but the disorderly use of discovery. It is a bureaucratic conscience, and therefore not without value. But it leaves one practical question untouched, which is, who among our aggrieved households possesses something worth taking, because it points not merely to personal shame, but to public concealment? Sir Julian may be one. There will be others. We must find the line before our engineer does." Though the matter had deepened, the walk back westward did not feel oppressive. The day was clear, the air cool rather than raw, and Holmes, once decided, moved with that light and eager energy which gave even grave inquiries the quality of exercise. We paused at a tea-room off St. James's Street, where he consumed toast and marmalade, with an appetite delayed rather than diminished by concentration. I remember this trivial fact because it signaled to me that the case, however intricate, had not yet crossed into that phase where Holmes forgot the ordinary functions of life. He was alert, amused, and entirely master of himself. By evening we had resumed our station at Baker Street, and there again the darker implications of the interview softened against familiar surroundings. Holmes sorted names upon cards. I reviewed Miss Hale's memorandum and copied a fair transcript. The ticking devices sat upon the side table, now harmless in the lamplight and almost companionable through repetition. It is a strange law of the nerves that what first unsettles may, by remaining present without action, become nearly soothing. The silver hound and brass case had passed into that intermediate state. They no longer startled the eye. They only reminded us that somewhere beyond the room, another intelligence remained at work. Holmes looked up suddenly from his cards. "Watson, should anything happen to me in the next 48 hours, I wish you to take that memorandum and give it to Miss Hale before any inspector lays hands upon it." I protested at once against so theatrical a contingency. "My dear fellow," said he with a laugh, I mention no melodrama. It is simply wise to distribute weight in advance. Cases touching old offices and current reputations are apt to produce confusion, and confusion loves to seize papers first and ask questions afterwards. I should be sorry for our lady visitor to have trusted us only to see her caution rewarded with an inventory number. Having disposed of the matter by this grotesquely practical explanation, he returned to his cards. The rain began again, after dusk, but lightly, and the room drew in upon itself with that enclosed softness so dear to memory. We spoke little. There are friendships which sustain themselves by perpetual exchange, and others that are best measured by silence easily shared. Ours, by then, had long belonged to the latter kind. I read for a while. Holmes smoked. The case, after its venture into official shadow, seemed almost mercifully distant. It was then, in the calmest hour of the evening, that Lestrade sent word of another theft. The message was brief and characteristic. A messenger from the yard brought a note bearing no salutation and scarcely more courtesy than an arrest warrant. Holmes read it, grunted once in acknowledgement, and handed it to me. A packet of letters had disappeared from the townhouse of Mrs. Arabella Vane in Bloomsbury. In their place had been left a small mechanism of enamel and steel fashioned in the likeness of a swan. Lestrade requested our attendance at once, and added, in a postscript so compressed that it seemed physically irritated, that the lady claimed the missing letters were of no importance whatever. "Excellent," said Holmes. "We are becoming almost domestic in our repetitions." Bloomsbury wore that evening an aspect gentler than its reputation for learned severity might have prepared one to expect. The squares lay still under rain-washed branches. Lamps burned in library windows. The house itself, though not grand, had that cultivated and somewhat faded distinction which often belongs to widows of independent means. Mrs. Vane received us in a drawing-room arranged less for display than for long private occupation. What? Books stood open. A piece of embroidery lay half-finished beside the sofa. There was a reading lamp with a green shade, and on the mantel several framed miniatures turned slightly away from one another, as though old relationships had not entirely survived photography. She was a handsome woman, perhaps a little beyond her youth, with silver beginning at the temples and a self-command which, if not native, had at least been excellently practiced. I could not fail to observe, however, that beneath the composure there ran a fatigue of the spirit greater than any mere burglary should have produced. Some faces do not need confession. They show that they have been holding back history for years. "The letters are private," said she, before Lestrade could begin. "That is all the police need know. I object to the entire business being inflated into significance by journalists and amateur philosophers." Holmes bowed. "Then permit a professional reasoner to remain modest. I ask only this: were the letters written to you, by you, or concerning some third person?" Her hands, which had remained quiet in her lap until then, tightened once upon the fabric of her dress. "By a member of my family," said she, "long dead." Holmes let the answer rest. It was one of his strengths to know when a question had yielded as much as it was likely to yield under present conditions. He turned instead to the little swan, which had been placed beneath a glass shade, as if the household could not decide whether to regard it as evidence or contamination. If the silver hound had shown elegance, the swan displayed refinement, almost bordering on tenderness. Its neck curved in a line of white enamel so thin that one feared to touch it. Along the tiny body, beneath the smooth shell, there worked a hidden mechanism of steel and gilded brass. Holmes wound it with the nail of one finger. The wings moved barely perceptibly, and the whole contrivance emitted a subdued, watery clicking, unlike the brighter tick of the earlier pieces. "A lyrical fellow," said Holmes. "Our engineer either improves or indulges himself." Mrs. Vane rose with sudden impatience. You speak of him as though he were a guest artist. A man entered my house, removed letters from my desk, and left behind this monstrous ornament. Must I admire the line of its neck before the police do their duty? You need admire nothing, said Holmes, with a gentleness that checked rather than inflamed her. But if we are to recover what was taken, we must know why these particular letters were selected. She turned away toward the fire. For some moments there was no sound but the rain beyond the shutters and the faint inner movement of the mechanism under its glass. Then she spoke in a lower voice. My late brother served for a period as a consulting engineer under a War Office contract. He wrote to me frequently, not on matters of state, but on health, weather, loneliness, and those irritations to which talented men are prone when made to answer to stupid systems. Toward the end his letters changed. He became angry in a way I had not known in him. There were allusions to falsified tolerances, altered reports, and pressure to withdraw objections. I begged him to leave the work, he wrote once more, saying only that he had done what conscience required and did not expect reward. Soon after, he disappeared from my life. Officially, he went abroad. Unofficially, I ceased to be told anything. Holmes's face had not changed, yet I knew by a subtle brightening about the eyes that the case had taken a distinct turn. Your brother's name? She hesitated. Leonard Vane, there it was. The initials from Miss Hale's memorandum, now enlarged into a life. Lestrade, who had thus far been enduring the interview with the impatience of a terrier obliged to attend a theological discussion, gave a short exclamation. Then why in heaven's name did you not tell us this at once? Mrs. Vane faced him with sudden dignity. Because, Inspector, I have spent 14 years discovering that the surest way to lose the truth of a painful matter is to place it in the hands of people eager to manage it. My brother was not mad, yet he was spoken of as unstable. He was not dishonest, yet his objections vanished, and his superiors prospered. If his letters are now stolen, I do not know whether the thief means harm or a rescue. I know only that I shall not submit his memory to another official simplification. I confess that her speech affected me strongly. Holmes, too, showed a shade more feeling than usual in his reply. Madam, said he, I cannot answer for every office in England, but I can answer for my own intention. Your brother's name will be treated with care. When we left Bloomsbury, Holmes was very quiet until we had walked half the square under dripping trees and yellow lamps. Then he said, Observe, Watson, how the case shifts beneath our feet. What began as theft among the comfortable resolves itself into the afterlife of a buried protest. Leonard Vane may be dead, hidden, or transformed by circumstance, but his path has not entirely cooled. And the person now stealing these letters and papers? Possibly Vane himself, possibly one who served with him, possibly an intelligence shaped by the same injury. We must not become too enamored of the simplest romance. Yet even as he cautioned me, there was a quickness in his step which betrayed excitement. We turned homeward through the rain, and again came one of those returns to safe and ordinary shelter, without which no long inquiry can be properly endured. Baker Street received us as if the city had merely stepped out and come back damp. Mrs. Hudson had left covered dishes warming near the grate. Holmes peeled off his wet gloves, accepted a bowl of soup, and for 10 blessed minutes spoke only of the weather in Sussex and the inadequacy of London umbrella makers. The very triviality of the conversation was medicinal. It washed the official dust and private sorrow from our minds without erasing what had been learned. Only after the meal did Holmes resume the matter. He set the Swan beside the Hound and the brass case, creating by accident or design a little menagerie of accusation along the sideboard. Our friend's style changes with his target, said he. Dog for dispatches, Swan for letters, brass box for memoranda. A mocking taxonomy. He leaves not clues but interpretations, Of what? Of what the absent object means to him. That is why the devices fascinate and mislead in the same instant. The police ask who made them. I ask what private language they compose. He felt thoughtful again. The rain eased toward midnight. I read for a little while, and then watched the fire. In that red and diminishing light, the three mechanisms appeared almost peaceful, as if whatever grievance had wound them were now asleep. It came to me that the middle of an investigation resembles the middle of a night. One no longer retains the simple security of evening, yet dawn has not begun. Instead, there is an interval of suspended meanings in which every sound carries farther than by day, and every certainty must be felt for by touch. The skill lies in not forcing light too soon. Holmes knew this instinctively. He never dragged a mystery forward. He let it circle, return, and deepen until the truth, tired of disguise, began at last to walk into the room of its own accord. The following morning, Holmes sent a telegram to the Clerkenwell supplier named by Mowbray, and before noon received in reply an invitation, if such it may be called, to call in person. We found the establishment tucked behind a frontage of scientific instruments and surveying tools, the sort of place to which practical men repair when they require something exact and do not care whether elegance attends it. Its proprietor, Monsieur Delatour, was a compact Frenchman of polished address, whose accent remained gracefully continental despite 2 decades in London. He greeted Holmes as one professional observer may greet another whom he has never met and has already estimated to be troublesome. "You inquire after specialized components," said he, once we were seated in his office above the shop. "I provide them, within the law, and occasionally just beside it where custom's forms grow imaginative. But I do not keep a ledger for every gentleman who buys a spring and a wheel." "No," said Holmes, "only for gentlemen who buy enough springs and wheels to suggest a philosophy." The Frenchman laughed softly. "Ah, then perhaps we understand one another," he remembered, after a little fencing, a customer of some years back, an Englishman, spare, reserved, speaking precisely, and paying in notes too clean for casual trade. He had purchased miniature escapements, jeweled bearings, and finely milled steel blanks in quantities excessive for a hobbyist, yet irregular for any standing workshop. He had returned once or twice, never giving a credible business name, and always asking whether certain parts could be altered to fit housings of his own design. Delatour recalled as well that the man possessed hands stained in the manner of one who works with chemicals as much as with metal. "A maker, then," said Holmes. "A maker certainly, but not only that. There are artisans who touch a component like lovers and engineers who touch it like magistrates. This one handled them as if each piece had once testified against him." "Did he give any address?" "One near the river, but temporary. I sent a parcel there, and it was later redirected. Such gentlemen do not sit still. They molt." Delatour drew from a file a copy of an old order slip. Upon it was scrawled a warehouse number in Wapping, and the initials LV no more. Yet the paper brought with it that little inward quickening which all investigators know, and which no one can properly explain. A line, long dim, had at last begun to darken beneath the pencil. We left the shop with the afternoon still before us. Holmes proposed that we avoid direct movement toward the address, and instead spend some hours in apparently unrelated occupation. "A man who has lived by concealment learns to feel pursuit before he sees it," said he. "Let us not flatter him by behaving like policemen." We lunched in Soho, visited a bookseller on Charing Cross Road, where Holmes purchased a volume he never afterwards opened, and only as dusk approached did we make our way east by a series of quiet streets and riverside lanes. The warehouse, when at last we reached the district, was one of many brick structures, standing shoulder to shoulder along a stretch of wharf, where the river smell of tar, wet rope, and old timber never quite leaves the stones. Fog had begun to gather over the water in low threads. Lamps burned uncertainly in it. The place itself appeared unoccupied, save by a night watchman who knew nothing and desired to know less. Holmes, after the briefest inspection, pronounced the building long abandoned by any person of present use. Yet from a drain by the wall he recovered a bent shaving of tempered steel, and from a nail in an inner beam he took a scrap of waxed packing paper from Delatour's shop. Someone had indeed worked there once, and not very idly. It was here that Constable Morton joined us at Lestrade's request. He was a younger man than the inspectors usually entrusted to observation duty, but keen, respectful, and possessed of the rare gift of standing still without appearing to yearn for applause. Holmes approved of him immediately, which in itself is worth recording. "Tonight," said Holmes, "we do not capture, we listen." So began one of the strangest vigils of my life. We took our positions within a shadowed recess between two stacked crates near the wharf entrance. The tide was turning. Chains knocked softly against moorings. Once or twice, voices traveled out of the fog and were lost again without visible source. The city seemed farther away than it could possibly have been, and the river, though only yards off, might have belonged to another country. Holmes became as still as stone. Morton, after one nervous shift, followed his example. I surrendered as best I could to patience, and let my senses settle into the place until its separate sounds no longer startled but merged. The creak, the drip, the distant footfall, the padded movement of mist itself. It must have been near 10 when Holmes touched my sleeve. Through an opening in the fog, I saw a figure moving along the inner edge of the wharf. He was tall, closely wrapped in a dark coat, and carried a narrow case under one arm. There was nothing theatrical in his motion. On the contrary, he moved with the economy of one accustomed to being unobserved, not because he sneaks, but because he belongs to neglected places. He paused beside the warehouse wall, bent briefly as though examining the lock of a side door, and then straightened with a swiftness that suggested he had heard or sensed some alteration in the night. Holmes rose in one smooth motion and stepped from cover. "Good evening," said he, not loudly. "You keep unusual hours for commerce." The man turned. For the briefest instant his face showed pale beneath the brim of his hat. Intelligent, hollow-cheeked, bearded more from neglect than fashion. I saw no panic in it, only calculation. Then he cast the narrow case toward the riverside boards, sprang back through the fog, and was gone before Morton had advanced 3 paces. We pursued, of course, but the place was a maze of wet timbers, blind turns, and dissolving visibility. Once I heard footsteps to my left, and found only water. Once Morton cried out that he had the man, and in the next breath admitted that he had seized a hanging tarpaulin. Holmes alone did not waste movement. He stopped where the case had fallen and stooped beside it. When I came up, breathing hard, I found him holding a small mechanism in one hand and the empty leather shell of the case in the other. The device, still warm, was of blued steel and brass, made in the form of a tiny lantern. Its shuttered panels opened and closed by means of an inner wheel, so that a pinprick of light, generated by some chemical bead or phosphorescent preparation within, pulsed faintly through the fog. "A signal," said Holmes softly. "How like him, a decoy, rather," I answered. "Both, in minds of this order, utility and expression seldom travel separately." The case itself contained no papers, only traces of graphite, steel filings, and a folded scrap torn from a map by Dye. Upon the scrap one could still make out a section of the city and a mark near the old riverside tower belonging to St. Bride's Wharf, now little used except for storage of clocks salvaged from defunct municipal buildings and awaiting auction or repair. Why such a place should matter, I could not then guess. Holmes, however, looked up from the scrap with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has not solved a puzzle, but has heard the first bars of its closing movement. We abandoned further chase. The fog favored the fugitive too thoroughly, and Holmes, once in possession of the map fragment and the lantern, showed no regret. As we turned westward again, the river behind us sighing in the dark, he said he wished to test whether he was observed. He also wished, perhaps reluctantly, to advance the matter. Such men tire of monologue. They begin to want an audience worthy of them. And is he Leonard Vane? Holmes tucked the lantern carefully into his pocket. Tonight I know only that he is alive in purpose, whether or not he still bears that name. But we are very near the center now, Watson. Near enough that every step must be soft. Back in Baker Street. The returned shelter felt almost unreal after the vaporous desolation of the docks. Mrs. Hudson, bless her practical heart, had left mulled wine and sandwiches under a clean cloth. The ordinary kindness nearly undid me, Holmes. However, seemed only invigorated. He placed the lantern beside the swan, hound, and brass case, then stood over the row of devices as a conductor might stand before a quartet of instruments just tuned. "The language grows clearer," said he. "Papers, letters, dispatches, and now light. Not theft alone, revelation." He said no more for some time, and when at last he did, it was only to ask me whether Miss Hale's card remained in the tray, and whether I had noticed that Mrs. C. Vane's embroidery silk was military blue. Such was his way. The mind in full hunt darts, rests, and darts again, all while the body may stand apparently idle before a fire. By midnight, the room had sunk into its old gentleness. Outside, London slept under fog. Inside, the tiny lantern pulsed once every few seconds with a dull marine glow, like thought itself trying not to wake the house. The next advance came not from the police, nor from trade, nor even from Holmes's own network of irregular informants, but from Miss Hale. She arrived shortly after luncheon, on the day following our vigil by the river, carrying no packet this time, only a small reticule and an expression of inward strain more eloquent than haste. Holmes had not yet left the breakfast table, though his breakfast had, as usual during active inquiry, survived him only in fragments. He rose at once and closed the door behind her with a degree of care which suggested that he expected her news to alter the balance of the matter. "I have been to see Mrs. Vane," said she, after the briefest greetings. "I went as a woman with a private concern, not as a reporter. She received me because I knew her brother's name before I rang. She showed me nothing directly, yet she let enough fall into silence that I can now tell you this. Leonard Vane was not merely an engineer under contract. He was, for a period, attached to a board reviewing field failures in optical range equipment supplied to the Army. He objected to certain substitutions in materials and calibration standard. His objections, she believes, were softened in summary, ignored in committee, and afterward represented as the irritations of a difficult specialist. Holmes nodded. "So far this confirms our line. What is new?" Miss Hale hesitated and then spoke more quietly. "Mrs. Vane also told me something she would not tell the police. After her brother withdrew from public life, she received 2 letters from him under another name. In the second, he wrote that if anything happened to him, the only persons who might later understand the shape of the wrong would be those who noticed what respectable men most wished to recover privately. He believed, in other words, that guilt leaves traces not in the ledgers of institutions, but in the hidden drawers of individuals. He had begun keeping note of what papers were retained by the officials who overruled him." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Excellent. There is more." She looked from him to me and back again. "One of the names in those letters was not Sir Julian's, nor Mrs. Vane's, nor any person yet mentioned in the paper. It was that of Colonel Matthew Wrexham, formerly of the Ordnance Evaluation Board, now retired and presently residing near Chelsea Embankment. Mrs. Vane believes her brother held Wrexham chiefly responsible for altering a technical annex after inspection had revealed defects. Holmes had already moved to the side table, where the map fragment from the docks lay beside the little lantern. "Why has Wrexham not yet been visited?" "Because," said Miss Hale, "he died 3 months ago." That answer checked even Holmes. "Dead?" "Quite. But his effects were dispersed irregularly, some sent to a nephew, some retained by a former confidential clerk, some sealed pending dispute. I suspect your unknown visitor has already begun searching among them. There is also one final point." Mrs. Vane remembered a phrase from her brother's last letter. She repeated it only after much effort. He wrote, "When the public record lies, time itself must be taught to testify." I thought at once of the mechanisms. Holmes stood perfectly still, his hand resting upon the back of a chair. "Yes," said he after a moment. "Yes, he would compel truth by means of sequence. The devices are not merely mockery. They are a clock made of incidents." Miss Hale looked troubled. "Then he means to continue. He means to finish." There followed a long, thoughtful pause, broken only by the coal settling in the grate. The room remained strangely gentle, despite the gravity of what was being said. Miss Hale sat with her gloves clasped in one hand. Holmes paced once to the window and back. Outside, the afternoon had dimmed under a white sky, a light drift of mist. It might have been any ordinary London day in autumn. There was no sign in the street below that old official wrongs were slowly assembling themselves into their own reckoning. At length, Holmes turned toward her with unusual directness. "Miss Hale, I shall ask a favor which has some impertinence in it. For the next day or two, refrain from printing anything connected with this affair, even by hint. The person we seek has arranged his own publicity with exquisite restraint. A premature article may drive him from the line just as it reaches conclusion." She accepted this without visible disappointment. "I did not come to outrun the truth." "No," said Holmes. "You came to protect it from noise. There are few people in London of whom I could say the same." She colored faintly, not with vanity, but with the embarrassment honest people feel when praised in exact measure. When she had gone, Holmes put on his coat almost at once. "Where are we bound?" I asked. "To my brother again. We have wrung caution from him. It is time to ring a name. Mycroft received us less tranquilly than before. I do not mean that he displayed agitation in any common sense, but rather that his calm had lost its ornamental quality and become workmanlike." He listened to Holmes's summary without interruption, one large hand shading his brow. When Holmes repeated Leonard Vane's phrase about teaching time to testify, Mycroft closed his eyes for a moment. "So," said he has preserved even that expression. Then he lives," said Holmes. Mycroft exhaled with a heaviness rare in him. "I did not say so, but if he does, then this prolonged pageant is exactly in character." He rose and crossed, as before, to the window. "The man you call Leonard Vane entered government service as a mathematical instrument specialist, and rose by sheer ability into consultative work beyond his rank. He possessed one of those minds which regard compromise not as social grease, but as structural weakness. During a period of urgency, he discovered that certain approved instruments, though outwardly compliant, had been manufactured to tolerances known to be unsafe in the field. Whether the substitutions began in greed, haste, or bureaucratic exhaustion hardly mattered to him. He saw only that men might trust devices designed to mislead them at distance and die by the error. He objected in writing. His objections implicated contractors, senior reviewers, and several gentlemen who preferred not to have their signatures associated with scrutiny. "And so?" asked Holmes. "And so," said Mycroft, "the matter was administratively diluted. Reports were redrafted. Responsibility became atmospheric. Vane refused to concur. There followed what follows in such cases: suggestions of strain on collegiality, technical rigidity, perhaps even instability. He vanished before the affair fully closed. Some believed he took work abroad, others believed he collapsed into private invention. I believed neither. I believed he had transferred his discipline from instruments to memory. Why conceal his identity now? Said I, unable to contain myself. Mycroft turned his pale eyes upon me, with more kindness than his reputation would suggest. Because, Dr. Watson, once a man has been officially diminished, institutions find it inconvenient for him to return enlarged by vindication. Holmes leaned forward. Then you admit that Leonard Vane is the intelligence behind these incidents. Mycroft considered him for several seconds. I admit that if Leonard Vane lives, and if he has chosen to reopen that old wound, he would do so not by speechifying, but by mechanism, sequence, and privately sourced embarrassment. He would force each keeper of a paper to reveal by his panic that the paper matters. He would build a chronology no committee could wholly deny. Where does he mean to end it? Here Mycroft hesitated longer than before. It was plain that he balanced two aversions against one another. Distaste for disorder and distaste for withholding a fact once his brother stood this near to it. At last he said, the missing annexes and corrected calibration tables were, after the inquiry, separated from the principal file. Most were destroyed or filed under harmless headings. One packet remained because no one could quite agree who owned the liability it represented. It was removed from the War Office and stored unofficially with other obsolete mechanical records awaiting disposal at St. Bride's Wharf Tower. The place was chosen for obscurity. It now becomes, by irony, a stage. The old clock tower by the river, said Holmes. So that was the mark upon the map. Yes, if Vane has been recovering papers from private hands, he will go there to unite them with the official residue. And if he means to force a final recognition, he may attempt something public enough to create permanent embarrassment. Holmes rose at once. Then we have no time to lose. Mycroft lifted one hand. Sherlock, listen carefully. If you go not as the agent of a scandal, but as the preventer of catastrophe. Vane is not vindictive in the ordinary sense. He is worse. He is principled under injury. Such men may sacrifice themselves with appalling neatness if they believe demonstration requires it. Holmes's expression softened by a shade. You speak of him almost with admiration. I speak of him, said Mycroft, as one speaks of a bridge built too honestly for a corrupt road. That was the last of it. We left the club immediately, and as we hurried toward the river, I felt not excitement exactly, but that grave narrowing of attention which comes when a long wandering pattern suddenly points. The city through which we moved seemed unchanged. Omnibuses, newspaper boys, clerks hurrying toward supper, women bargaining over flowers in the rain. Yet somewhere ahead, in an old tower, among obsolete mechanisms, a man who had once trusted exact instruments more than flexible men was preparing, perhaps, to make time itself bear witness. By the time we reached St. Bride's Wharf, the evening had thickened into one of those river nights in which distance is reduced not by darkness, but by vapor. The tower rose from a cluster of disused sheds, like an old witness whom commerce had forgotten, but time had not. Its brickwork was damp, its narrow windows unevenly lit, and from somewhere high within there came the muffled knock of old machinery settling under strain. Around the base stood dismantled clock faces and neglected relics of public timekeeping. Lestrade was already there with 2 men, and Constable Morton. We entered by a side door and moved into a low chamber crowded with empty clock cases and shelves of tagged parts. A spiral stair led upward. Halfway up, Holmes found pinned to the wall a strip of paper bearing only a sequence of dates and initials. Another waited at the next landing, then another. We were climbing, it seemed, through the skeleton of a suppressed record. At the top, we came into the clock chamber itself. A high circular room open to the interfaces of 4 dials, with the old public movement standing at the center like a gigantic exposed heart. Years taller than a man interlocked in shadow, a maintenance lamp burned upon a table, and by its light I saw that the place had been transformed into a workshop of temporary but astonishing order. On one side stood trays of components, on another a row of mechanisms in various stages of design. At the far window stood a man in a dark coat, one hand resting lightly on a stack of papers weighted by a brass wheel. He turned before Holmes spoke, as though he had measured our climb by the tower's own vibrations. "You are punctual, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I hoped you would come before the police made a muddle of the sequence." The beard was streaked with gray. The eyes were pale, tired, and extraordinarily steady. This, then, was Leonard Vane. Holmes advanced 2 steps. "You have arranged an ingenious demonstration, Mr. Vane. The papers in your possession concern the altered tolerances and amended reports connected with the old contract. You have recovered corroboration from private hands and linked it to the official residue stored here. Your devices, left in place of the stolen items, form commentary as well as chronology." Vane's mouth moved in something not unlike a smile. "I did not steal corroboration. I reclaimed fragments of truth from frightened men. What do you mean to do now?" Holmes asked. Vane looked toward the great movement at the room's center. "At midnight, the tower will illuminate each dial in turn. Behind them, I have mounted glass slides copied from the critical annexes, the revised figures, the names, the dates. Long enough for the wharf and opposite bank to see. Long enough for the newspapers to ask why a forgotten tower suddenly lectures the river. And after midnight." "After midnight," said Vane, "I become unnecessary." There was no melodrama in the words that made them terrible. Holmes met them without visible alarm. "No," said he quietly. "After midnight, you become absent from the argument you have spent years constructing. Dead men are administratively easy. You above all people should know that." The chamber fell still, save for the immense patient movement of the central clock. Vane's hand remained upon the lighting mechanism, yet his eyes dropped to the papers. "They called me exacting," he said at last. "Rigid. Men died trusting instruments I had warned them not to trust. Others escaped blame by amending adjectives. What witness remains to such things if not sequence, if not forcing time to speak where men would not?" Holmes answered after a pause so measured that it seemed chosen as carefully as a gear. "A witness remains if he continues to exist inconveniently. A dead engineer becomes a mood. A living one remains a problem." The appeal found its mark. Vane's shoulders dropped by a fraction. The hand upon the lighting mechanism loosened. It was then, of course, that Lestrade ruined everything by stepping sharply forward and calling for surrender in the name of the law. The interruption was slight, yet in a chamber balanced so delicately it had the force of a blow. Vane started, snatched the top packet of papers from the table, flung them toward Holmes, and struck the release lever of a side access hatch concealed behind the outer gearing. Cool fog rushed through. Before Morton could cross the floor, Vane had slipped behind the turning weights and was gone. There was no triumph in the room. Holmes laid the bundle upon the table and sorted it with swift care. Here at last were copies, annotations, calibration tables, memoranda, and one original annex signed in initials that matched those on the strips downstairs. Beside them lay a final sheet in Vane's hand, addressed simply to whomever still distinguishes correction from concealment. In it, he stated, without rhetoric, the sequence of substitutions, objections, alterations, and suppressions which had given birth to his long campaign. Midnight came and passed without any public revelation, save the ordinary dark gleam of the river. We returned to Baker Street near dawn, exhausted rather in spirit than body. Mycroft arrived within the hour, took charge of the principal documents, and said only, that quiet corrections might still be made. Holmes did not argue long. He knew as well as I that some truths, once delayed, never emerge cleanly into daylight. They are managed, reduced, and absorbed, yet not wholly. Enough had been seen, enough connected in living minds, that the old silence could no longer pass as innocent. After Mycroft had gone, Holmes stood a long while at the window. The room behind him was littered with the remnants of our inquiry. The brass case, the hound, the swan, the lantern, Miss Hale's memorandum, and the small fatigue of cups and ash that trails every serious investigation. "Well, Watson," said he at last, speaking so softly that I barely heard him, "we have prevented a spectacle and assisted a correction. Whether we have served justice I leave to kinder or sterner men than myself." He did not say that the matter was over, nor did I. Some endings do not close. They settle into the room and remain there, like the aftertick of a mechanism whose spring is spent, but whose meaning still vibrates in the air. In the weeks that followed, Leonard Vane was not captured. The official corrections proceeded, no doubt, in the manner of official corrections everywhere, discreetly, belatedly, and with great confidence that discretion itself constituted part of the remedy. Yet even now, when London is quiet and some small regular sound goes on in a lamplit room, my thoughts return to that tower above the river, and the man who sought to make time bear witness because men had refused. I do not count him among criminals in the easy way, though neither can I call his course wholly innocent. Beneath all his artifice lay the original plain wound. That exact knowledge had been muffled by convenient language, and that those who profited from imprecision found society eager to help them misremember. For myself, I remember less the official summary than the sounds. The hush of Baker Street after rain, the watery clicking of the swan beneath glass, the pulse of the little lantern in the fog, the gigantic slow heart of the tower clock, while two minds measured one another across old gilt. And so, if late at night the room is warm, and the world beyond the curtains seems willing for a little while to postpone its demands, you may imagine that somewhere among the roofs and river mist there persists the faintest echo of those small, deliberate mechanisms, keeping their own private time. The names connected with them have blurred, but the question they marked has not entirely slept. It waits, as many truths do, not in noise, but in patience, in the gentle interval between one tick and the next.